Good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I couldn't be more excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Heather McGhee and Senator Elizabeth Warren. Thanks for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 100 videos of past events archived on our website and on our YouTube channel for free public viewing, so please be sure to explore. And now for the formal introduction. Heather McGhee's first book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, was released today. She is the board chair of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization, and also serves on the boards of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Open Society Foundation's U.S. programs. For nearly 2 decades, Ms. McGhee helped build the nonpartisan Think and Do tank Demos, serving 4 years as president. Her 2016 conversation on a C-SPAN program with a white man who asked for her help to overcome his racial prejudice went viral, receiving more than 10 million views and sparking wide media coverage that included a New York Times op-ed, a New Yorker piece, and a CNN town hall. She shared her opinions, writing, and research in numerous outlets, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Politico, and National Public Radio. And her 2018 TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone, has been viewed over 2 million times. A side note, we discovered in the green room that she also grew up for many years in Evanston and is graduated from both Orrington Elementary and Haven Middle School, for all of the Evanstonians on the Zoom tonight. And now Elizabeth Warren, a fearless consumer advocate who has made her life's work the fight for middle-class families, was reelected to the United States Senate for a second term in 2018 by the very smart people of Massachusetts. Senator Warren learned firsthand about the economic pressures facing working families growing up in a family she says was on, quote, the ragged edge of the middle class. She got married at 19 and after graduating from the University of Houston, started teaching in elementary school and enrolled at Rutgers School of Law while her daughter was a toddler. Shortly after she graduated law school, her son was born. She hung out a shingle and practiced law out of her living room, but soon returned to teaching. As a law professor for more than 30 years, Senator Warren taught courses on commercial law, contracts, and bankruptcy. She has written more than 100 articles and 11 books, including 4 national bestsellers. It is fans' deep pleasure to present to you Heather McGhee and Senator Elizabeth Warren.
It is so good to be here. Oops, there we go. Are we good? It's good to see you. Thank you, Lonnie. And I'm so delighted to be here with Heather on the day of your first book launch. That is fabulous. It's so good to be with all of you tonight. You know, I wish we could be together in person. We would do a fabulous selfie line and lots of pinky promises. I wish that we could get together in person to connect so that we can continue in the fight for justice. But we know we can't do this in person. It just means we're going to have to find another way. So I'm glad to be here today because the problems our nation faces are enormous. A pandemic that continues to burn out of control, an economic crisis, the threat of climate change, and a racial reckoning in America that is long overdue. Big problems call for big solutions. And so that is why I am honored to be here with my friend and my fellow warrior in the fight for social, racial, and economic justice, Heather McGhee. You've already heard one introduction, but I have to add my own, that Heather is an author, a speaker, an advocate, but most of all, she is a powerhouse who knows how to find and who knows how to win. But here's what I love most about Heather. In addition to her big heart and her unwavering commitment to equity and to justice, Heather speaks my love language, policy. For nearly 2 decades, it has been my honor to witness her courage, her commitment, her leadership in crafting the kind of bold, progressive policies that build opportunity for everyone. Pick any issue that keeps Americans up at night. And you'll find Heather's guiding hand behind the scenes fighting for structural change. And from the financial crisis to the climate crisis to student loan debt to infrastructure, Heather's fight has found a common enemy: racism. You know, there's a reason for that. Racism is intricately woven into the fabric of American society. That is a truth that we must all understand if we're going to solve the enormous problems that lie ahead of us. And here's why. Racism doesn't just tear apart Black and brown communities. It keeps all working people down. Racism props up the wealthy and the powerful, leaving them free to take more wealth and more power for themselves. Until we understand and tackle the impact of structural racism across our basic systems, our country will continue to suffer, our communities will remain sick, and millions of our brothers and sisters will live their lives afraid. So Heather's new book, The Sum of Us, teaches us this powerfully important lesson with vivid details and calls on all of us to take bold action, especially in times of crisis. And I am honored to have a chance to dive into this body of work and to hear Heather's urgent call for action. So it is my pleasure to be here in this conversation with my dear friend, Heather McGhee. Heather, you ready? Want to get started?
Yes, let me just compose myself. Yes, that was so beautiful.
Oh, no, but all true and all from the heart. So Heather, I know about this book, obviously, a long, long time ago. I've known about your work in this area, but I noticed just a few days after he was sworn in, that President Biden gave a speech on racial equity. And he said, and I want to quote it here, he said, "We've bought the view that America is a zero-sum game in many cases. If you succeed, I fail." That you in your book identify this zero-sum worldview as the reason why, as you say, Americans can't seem to have nice things. So you also seem to share this view with President Biden that the zero-sum paradigm is false. So can you start us out by talking about where did this idea come from?
First of all, obviously, thank you so much to FAN for hosting my launch event, and to Elizabeth Warren, the great senator from Massachusetts, the champion for working people, one of my all-time political heroes, for saying yes to being in this conversation. I just can't believe that this book that I've been writing, you know, in a conversation of one for the past 4 years is now out in the world, and that you have, of all people, have read it and we get to talk about it. I'm pinching myself. Let's dive in. Okay, so
Fabulous.
This zero sum is something that is a concept that is unfortunately on the rise as a worldview, particularly among white Americans. It's more prevalent among white Americans than other Americans. And it's this idea that basically we're sort of locked in this racial competition, that progress for people of color has to come at white people's expense. $1 more in my pocket means $1 less in yours. Now, it was very clear to me when I sort of dug into the social science research to find this paradigm that it was a self-defeating principle to operate under in a society where we are so interconnected, and where it can lead people to root against the same kinds of supports that could help yourself just because they help somebody else. So I felt like I needed to get back to the root of it. And so the first chapter goes into the history of where we got this idea of the zero-sum racial hierarchy from. And it turns out that it was really an idea that was created and sold by the very worst elements of American society, those who were going to profit from the pain of Black and Indigenous people. And so that original economic formula, stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen people, was one that needed a justification and needed some kind of rationale to encourage the white masses to root against the liberation or justice of people of color because they feared it might come at their expense. And it's just been sort of rehashed and reinvigorated generation after generation by those same forces. Obviously, today it is the core narrative in the right-wing media infrastructure. It's the worldview through which Donald Trump sees everything. And it's also what's really pushed in a propagandistic way from, millionaires and billionaires, the paid bullies in the corporate media, and those who sell hate for profit in terms of the right-wing media machine. Ultimately, though, it saps our ability to work together across lines of race and therefore impoverishes us all.
So you talk about this. I just want to peel this back just a little bit more because I thought this chapter that you start with, when you talk about the zero-sum game, it starts with we've got to have a rationalization for how we could take away land from the indigenous people. We've got to have a rationalization for how it is that we built the wealth of this nation on the backs of enslaved people. So it starts with, we have to have this racial difference. We must start this nation on racial division because some people have to be more entitled than others. Okay. And then the question becomes that's the origin of it. But then it changes over time. And you talk about this in the book to become this very overt, it's going to be $1 out of your pocket. Anything that so it both keeps the division sharp, but also the zero sum then becomes deadly. Yeah. And then you think about how this fits in then, for example, with unionization. Because you talk about this in your book, about unionization comes from a very different place. So you talk about both the rise and then the erosion of unions and very much how unions are eroded after the civil rights movement. And you talk about visiting an auto plant in Mississippi. Can you share that story with everybody?
Yeah. So what racism and the live zero-sum racism does is it attacks the logic of collective action. If we're not on the same team, then I'm not going to join with you, even though we may have common problems and need common solutions to them. So what does that threaten? Collective bargaining. I traveled to Canton, Mississippi, right outside of Jackson, in the wake of a failed union organizing drive with the United Auto Workers. Now, I'm from the Midwest, and so those of us who are from the Midwest know that, auto manufacturing jobs are supposed to be the great jobs. And we also know that the reason why they're great jobs is because of collective bargaining. Mm-hmm. So for me, the fact that a group of workers at the Nissan factory would have voted no to organizing into a union was sort of like a man bites dog story. I felt like I needed to know why anybody would sort of choose to give away higher wages and benefits and job security. And so when I arrived in Canton, Mississippi, I met white and Black workers, management, and people on the line who described this subtle hierarchy in the plant, where the cushier jobs were those who were that white folks had. As one worker said to me, the white folks' jobs are so cush that they can go straight from work to the happy hour. They don't have to go home and shower, right? This is the way you could tell that there were the better jobs. And so in many ways, for those little perks, for the little subtle ways that white folks got slightly better jobs on the line, they were able to really buy into this zero-sum story. A worker named Joey just put it bluntly. He said, the white workers say, if the Blacks are for it, then I'm against it. I'm not voting for it if the Blacks are for it. Mm-hmm. And it was really the sense that if Black folks are coming up, then that means white folks are coming down. That's what a worker named Chip told me. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, these little perks that white workers were getting from an unorganized plant, in my mind, were no equal to better healthcare, better wages, better job security for everybody. But it's what W.B. Du Bois called the wages of whiteness, the idea that you may not get the material wages. You may sacrifice actually a lot of money in a class hierarchy just to feel like you're on top of a racial hierarchy.
So this is part of what you talk about in the book. You make the point all the way through this that racism costs everybody. And to me, your union example is one of the perfect illustrations of this, that presumably if they decided to unionize, everybody could have had higher wages, right? Everybody could have had a better job. But that the cost of racism, if the blacks are for it, then I'm against it, racism, that the consequence of that is it held everybody back because you never got the two sides joining together in this. So we watch then over time and just fit this narrative in a little bit more as we've watched union power weaken across this country. And you place it in time right after the civil rights laws are put into place. Can you just say a bit more about this, explaining this to people?
Yeah, so, there's this sort of golden era of shared prosperity, which progressive economists and the like to talk about, right? It's sort of the New Deal era until the end of the 1960s. It's really the time that the great American middle class was created through deliberate public policy investments in our tax laws, our housing laws, our financial protection and antitrust laws, as well as, of course, our labor laws. We had a high point of about 1 out of 3 workers being represented in a union, and whole industries really not just having collective bargaining, but having an ethos that workers needed to be paid enough to buy the goods that were being made in America, and that it was a virtuous cycle. Unions were the backbone of that social contract. And I often kind of picture it quite literally when I first started learning about this progressive social contract in the middle of the century, right? It was somebody from labor, somebody from government, and somebody from big business sort of sitting down at a table and, looking into each other's eyes and shaking hands and saying, okay, we're gonna set the rules with a guiding principle that everybody should have a decent standard of living. Now, each of those people who would have represented each of those 3 forces would have been a white man. Like literally, they were Walter Reuther, they were the head of GM, they were Eisenhower. And then I picture somebody knocking on the door, and it's a group of women and people of color saying, hey, we want into that table too. We want to be part of that contract for shared prosperity. And that was what was happening in the 1960s. And then, unable to sort of see themselves in the other signatories, those leaders in big business and government kind of got up and walked away and cut a side deal in another room, leaving workers alone and women and people of color alone when an American dream became harder and harder to attain. Mm-hmm. That's for me, the counter narrative of what has been a class first story about why we got into the inequality era. I believe strongly that it has to do with corporate power organizing. It has to do with a neoliberal economic worldview coming in. But what allowed the majority of white people to go along with this when that other social contract had been so good for their families? And that was the missing piece for me. And that was racism. Why was it that the white majority began to turn its back on unions, which had made the white middle class, mainly in a very exclusionary way, actually, for much of labor history? Why did they turn their back on government and start becoming, libertarians who were anti-government and pro-austerity? Between 1960 and 1964, the share of white Americans who believed that government ought to guarantee a job for everyone who wanted one and guarantee a minimum income in the country, right? These are really radical left-wing ideas now, was over 2/3.
Wow.
I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Can you imagine how different our policy battles would have been if the sort of median white person wanted a guaranteed income and a guaranteed job for everyone?
Richard Nixon, right, is the person who wanted to propose the universal basic income.
That's
UBI.
right.
Nixon?
this used to be a somewhat bipartisan consensus that, yes, obviously everyone should have a decent
Yep.
standard of living.
Yep.
And of course, there was an asterisk to it, right? All of the New Deal and mid-20th century programs that really invested in economic security had this asterisk, either in intention, like with redlining and the FHA, or in practice, like with the GI Bill that was filtered through a segregated educational system and a segregated financial system. And so between 1960, when it was over 2/3 of white Americans rooting for this
Ready to go.
progressive government role in their lives, to 1964, support dropped in half. I had to double check the numbers. I was like, what do you mean? You don't get from nearly 70% to 35% in the course of 4 years, but you do when the civil rights movement bursts into the white public consciousness. 1963, the March on Washington, those demands were included. It was for jobs and freedom. You began to see the Democratic Party saying, we're going to extend this circle. And of course, we all know, or should, that that the white majority has never voted for a Democrat for president since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. That was the break with the white majority and the sort of New Deal social contract.
Yeah. Wow. And the way you put this together, the power of the change and the way you look at the numbers, we talk about the union movement and you really see it there. I think about it in terms of the crash in 2008, just another turn of the crank here, because you talk about this in your book too. The dominant narrative about the financial crisis of 2008 is that it was basically a decade or so of people buying houses they couldn't afford, just profligate, right? They were out there doing crazy things. But you make a very persuasive case that, nope, it was racism that caused the financial crisis, that ultimately cost America 8 million jobs, $19 trillion in household wealth. Home ownership rates have still not recovered from that crash. So knit the pieces together for folks so everybody gets a chance to hear it.
Okay, I'm going to try not to geek out too much that we're having this conversation right now. Okay,
so this
focus.
Channel your inner geek here. It's okay.
This is the conventional wisdom, right? I'm sorry, I just have to say, when you took down Michael Bloomberg for saying exactly that, it was one of the most beautiful moments in American political debate history. I just have to say that. Everybody go to YouTube, find it again. Because what Bloomberg said, to his defense is just sort of the kind of conventional wisdom, right? That the reason why we had a financial crisis was exactly that. We had redlining and that was too bad, but then we just went in the other direction and we gave too many people who shouldn't have had credit. Now, what does that mean? Let's unpack that.
Yeah.
This was the first issue that I ever sort of cut my policy teeth on in the 2000s.
I remember.
How we met. And what we were seeing in the early 2000s was that this strange new mortgage product, the more expensive subprime mortgage loan, was being aggressively marketed in Black and brown neighborhoods to existing homeowners, right? That's another, let's say that, first of all, it wasn't people buying houses they couldn't afford. At first, it really was the majority of subprime loans were for people who already had houses and they were looking to refinance, or they were being sold refinances. And then the justification for these subprime mortgages, for a more expensive mortgage, was that these people were bad credit risks. Now, here's where the racism comes in. From the beginning of the regulated mortgage market in the United States government has drawn lines around Black neighborhoods with zero evidence to just say that Black people are equated with risk, that Black people are bad with money, tidy justification for denying them ways to get more money. And even though redlining officially ended in the generation before this practice, before the subprime mortgage lending crisis, you had the same logic. And so the majority of subprime loans went to people who had credit enough and good enough credit to qualify for prime loans, because sadly, there's no suitability standard. There's no requirement that I sell you a loan that matches your credit scores. I just
I
can
want,
tell
you
you,
to stop. I want to
yeah,
underline that, because it's like one of these, when you're reading it in a book, you need to stop and underline it. I actually want to underline that line, that the majority of people who got subprime mortgages, in fact, qualified for prime mortgages, and they got sold crap.
yes, correct. Exactly.
Not because they were bad credit risk, not because they were trying to buy 7 houses and leverage them and do weird things. So how did that happen?
It's because they could get away with it. And why could they get
They
away with it?
meaning the bank.
The lenders and the bankers and the brokers,
Yeah.
right? They could get away with it because they were targeting the people who were least protected, least reflected, right, in the upper echelons of the regulators and the bankers and the lawmakers, and least respected by that financial elite. And so I was in meetings with regulators who basically said the problem was we, let these people we put these people into houses they couldn't afford. Meanwhile, the wheels are turning, right? There's just an enormous amount of money that can be made when you're charging someone 9% on a 6-figure housing loan, as opposed to the 4% that they actually qualify for. Wall Street is like, wow, this is printing money. Give us more and more and more of it. The sort of formula is tested out for subprime loans, the tricks and traps, the balloon payments, the teaser rates, all of the different fees that are put on there. In the book, I talked to this beautiful couple, Janice and Isaiah Tomlins, this African-American senior couple who got just absolutely targeted, and thankfully were one of the very few who was able to sort of escape foreclosure. But when you read, as I did, the terms of their loan, it's just criminal. And yet so often there was no accountability. And so then what happened was this formula that had been tested first on Black families. This chapter in my book is called Ignoring the Canary, because Black families were the canary, and because their pain was sort of rationalized. When regulators began to see these foreclosure numbers in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Atlanta, they were saying, you know what? It's sort of the market doing its thing, working itself out. There were these stereotypes about Black people and money. And so there was also a lot of money to be made on the other end. And then, of course, we know how the story ends. We know that then the wider and whiter mortgage market was sort of there for the taking. And in the very last years, it really was, subprime for everybody. That was the thing. But so many people think it was the borrower's fault and not the loan's fault, and think it was basically the victims of redlining and exclusion and subprime lending and predatory lending who were at fault. And that is a racist way of thinking, where you sort of invert who is at fault and you blame the victim because of racist stereotypes.
Yeah. And you make the point that you alluded to it here, that the instruments were perfected in the Black communities and in the brown communities, that they tried the teaser rates and the liar's loans and all of the little games, tested them out, sucked enormous wealth out of those communities, but then took it nationwide. I mean, really went everywhere. And that's where, now we get back to your point again, and the point, of course, of the book, that ultimately the losses were not just confined to the Black and brown communities. They hurt everybody. And the jobs it cost, the savings it cost, the homes it cost. So I see this, it really, to me, it's the paradigm of the theme of your book. It's all right there and packed in the space. What would you say, of about a decade, right? You could just kind of pack it in. That this thing went from invention to crash in less than 10 years, about that. I think that's about right. Yeah. So you alluded a minute ago to the fact that the majority of white Americans have not voted for a Democrat for president since Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. So what has been the impact of that in terms of inequality in our country?
Well, and I say this not as a partisan, but someone who just studies the economic plans and orthodoxies of the two parties. You had a sort of New Deal consensus among the white majority that government had a role to play in creating safe and open markets, that government had a role to play in creating the public structures that allow for families to go out there and innovate. And that was a Democratic consensus. And then you had a Republican consensus that has been one where the main policies are tax cuts and deregulation, with a little bit of racial scapegoating and demonization and punishing brown people, black people, and immigrants on the side for good measure. And so that said, we've had this inequality era since really the mid 1970s through to this date, where white families as well, who are the largest group of the uninsured, the largest group of people in poverty, have nonetheless voted for a party that feeds them nothing but tax cuts, deregulation, and racial resentment. We have a very racially polarized political system. And what it means is that there is a party that sort of markets a racial kind of, it's like cultural marketing around being a party for white people in, dog whistles and somewhat settled terms, although obviously
I was going to say bullhorns. Yes.
Yeah. And offers none of the economic gains that families need to survive. So it does mean that white families and white voters have become more conservative. I can't believe we've made it this long into the conversation without me saying the thing I normally lead with, which is the public pools, right? This is this example, it's what's on the cover of the book. It is really the parable at the heart of my book, which is that in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, this country built nearly 2,000 grand resort style public swimming pools. And many of them
swimming pools.
Public swimming pools.
I underline that, because this is not country club swimming pools we're talking about, where you had to be able to pay. This is public swimming pools for all the kids in the summer when it's hot. I also grew up in places where it's hot, right? In Oklahoma in the summer. So public swimming pools, we put all this public money into public swimming pools and these grand with park around them and trees and all kinds of fabulous stuff. I'm sorry, Heather, I just want to set the stage here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And what happens is that many of them were segregated in whites only, right? The public pool, right, it's a place where you have to be in real sort of levels of undress and intimacy. And so the idea in many parts of the country, not just the South, of blacks and whites swimming together was verboten, right? Now, that said, Black families were taxpayers as well. And so their money was going to build these public pools. And so the civil rights movement, you started to see court action to integrate the pools. I visited one of the many places, Montgomery, Alabama, where instead of integrating the pools, the city council voted to close the pool, to drain the public pool rather than integrate it. They drained the water, they backed trucks up with dirt in it, they concreted it over, they seeded it with grass. In Montgomery, Alabama, they closed down the entire Parks and Recreation Department. They even sold off the animals in the zoo. And they kept it closed for 10 years. The entire decade of the 1960s, there were no public parks open in Montgomery, Alabama, just to enforce segregation. And for me, that's a parable because it helps to explain how it is that a group of people who'd been taught for generations to distrust and disdain their fellow Americans would turn away from the common investments and resources that make everyone's lives better. And that's sort of where we are today. I include a real chapter on healthcare. Why is it that the United States stands alone in not having universal healthcare? It's an extremely racialized issue. The majority of white Americans oppose the Affordable Care Act, even though white Americans are the largest group of the uninsured. And when the policy ideas in the Affordable Care Act are attributed to Bill Clinton and not Barack Obama, the support goes up and the racial resentment levels come down. I talk about the issue of debt-free college, which is something that I know you're very passionate about. And for me, that's a racial story as well.
Yeah. In fact, let's do this. Let's talk about it in education for a minute, because we've done it in sort of the whole financial services area, and we've done it in unionization. But education, for a huge part of our modern history, 100 years, but the idea was, in effect, we would publicly pay for the education of our children, right? Free public schools. Back then it was only grades 1 through 12 or K through 12, because that's all we thought they needed. Didn't do preschool, but, and then the same thing, you had the land grant colleges. I often talk about having gone to a college that cost $50 a semester. And the way it could cost $50 a semester is because the taxpayers are in there really basically paying for the thing. So we had this idea that education was the birthright of a child, that all children, right? Every child was supposed to have an opportunity to get an education. That's how America builds a future. That's how every kid can grow up to be president, right? Is the kind of notion, but you say, whoa, watch the racialization through this. So talk about that.
Well, this really harkens back to the asterisk I talk about on the social contract, right? That it's public goods only for the public that is perceived to be good.
Oh, white public, right?
Public college was free when public meant white.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is an important issue. Some other folks have talked about, white people voting against their own interests, and they usually talk about cash welfare. And they're sort of like, oh, those dumb, poor white people who, are opposed to welfare, even though they rely on it. And it's like, there's this sort of distancing from this. And so I wanted to talk about college, like a firmly middle and upper middle class issue, where most white parents who are struggling to pay student loan bills and tuition bills don't think about how they may be voting for a socially liberal but fiscally conservative worldview that is costing them in the privatization of what used to be a public good, which is college. It is no accident, and I tell this story in the book, that we went from publicly funded colleges where you had low tuition because states paid most of it, and then a grant from the federal government picked up the rest, including often living expenses, to privately funded public colleges, where the majority of states now fund a majority of their expenses through tuition. And then the federal government moved from grants to loans that I would argue are not really financial aid at all, because they have to be repaid back with interest, at least 33% on average. And this is one of those great sort of illustrations where I am by no means saying that racism, that the burdens and the costs of racism are not felt most acutely by people of color. Black students, because of the racial wealth divide that was engineered from deliberately racist public policy, have to borrow more at higher terms, and because of racism and discrimination in the job markets, often have to take longer to pay it back. Mm-hmm. College debt burdens are most acute among Black graduates, so much so that Black households headed by a college graduate have less wealth than a white household headed by a white high school dropout, right? This is where history shows up in your wallet, and no amount of education and income can undo the effect of compounding interest of racist decisions made before, those students and graduates were even born. But 63% of white students at public colleges now have to graduate too. This is an issue of shared economic pain. And proposals like yours to forgive student debt, to cancel student debt, to move to a debt-free college system are popular, but there's about a 20 percentage point gap in support between white people and Black and brown people for the idea of debt cancellation. And the most opposed are the older white Republicans who themselves were the beneficiaries of the whites-only social contract of public college previously.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that makes this book so engaging to read is that you retell stories that we know part of, and then you layer into it how race is so deeply woven into parts of it, like the notion of what constitutes a public school and public support for that. It's just terrific work. But here's the best part about the book. The book is not just one terrible tale after another. And at the end, we all say, you know, we got to give up on this. It's an enormously hopeful book because you draw this together, having taken these very vivid examples of how costly racism is. And you talk about there's another way to approach all of these issues, and it's with a solidarity dividend. I love this notion. So what is a solidarity dividend?
A solidarity dividend is a gain that we can only unlock by working together across lines of race to find common solutions to our common problems. And each of the chapters actually includes an example of a solidarity dividend that I found in my journey to write this book across the country. Examples of solidarity dividends are like in Richmond, California, where a multiracial working class group was able to band together, find political interest, and take on the big polluter in their community, Chevron, and create something of a start of a Green New Deal in this incredibly segregated and polluted city. At the end of the labor chapter, where I tell the bad story of the loss of the union possibility in Mississippi, I talk about the Fight for 15, which is one of the most vivid solidarity dividend stories that we have. In Kansas City, I talked to a worker named Bridget who joined because she saw herself for the first time, a white woman, she saw herself for the first time in a Latina woman who talked at an organizing meeting about her life. And she said, you know what, that's exactly like me. And she explicitly rejected the zero sum us versus them that had been sort of the received wisdom in her family, in this sort of white Irish family, and said, in fact, as long as we're divided, we're conquered. And in the end of the book, I visit a town, a dying mill town in the whitest state in the country, where an influx of Muslim African refugees, right, the sort of trifecta of the scapegoated identity, right, has actually reanimated this dying town and sort of made the main street vibrant again. And I talked to white people who were very much in the kind of diseases of despair, isolation, drug addiction, alcoholism, and their lives had been changed and transformed in relationship and fellowship with people across lines of race. That is the promise of America. That is why we were all sort of thrown together in this land of ancestral strangers, where there's a tie. There's someone here with a tie to every single community on the globe. I do believe we're a young country. We still have a chance to figure this out. In some ways, I'm so deeply hopeful because it feels like we've been, knocking our heads on how do we address the economy. And it turns out that if we just unspool this one thread of racism and demonization, the chips can fall in a way that will be more prosperous for everyone.
Yeah, this is the part I love the best about this book. So it is a fabulous book. I see Lonnie has rejoined us so that everyone else gets to ask questions. But I will say once again, it's a terrific book, Heather. You should be so enormously proud of it. And I hope everybody reads it. I mean that, because it's a good book to cause us to think again about things we thought we already knew and question some of those assumptions. We do that, and we really do have an opportunity to build a much stronger, better nation. So thank you for writing this book, Heather. And Lonnie, thank you for having us here. And I'll let you do the questions. Good to see you.
Senator Warren, thank you so much for your time and for imparting so much, for a great interview and for bringing just so much to Heather's launch party here. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Delighted to be here. Thank
Best
you.
wishes to you. Thank you. Okay, so there she goes.
All right.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Lonnie. Thank you.
How was that?
It's all right.
How did that feel? I noticed that I felt myself when I was doing the intro, you know, we've hosted a lot of people, but sometimes, you know, you just have a set of guests that just gets you so super excited. And I texted a friend of mine, I said, I think I was waving my hands around the whole time while I was doing kind of like a little kid. Oh my gosh. So let's jump in and get some questions. So I'm pulling questions off of the Q&A. We had about almost 40 questions submitted in advance, and now we have a number of questions, more and more coming in. So I'm just gonna start and putting some stuff out there from tonight. So this is a little bit thematic. We hear it from a couple different people in different ways. So it's kind of an emblematic question, which is from Erin. She says, my very conservative, highly educated brother is insistent that systemic racism doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. How do you get through to someone like that? How do I even start?
Well, I'm just going to say what came to my heart, because I would say, you know, on the one hand, you really do, there's so much data out there. There's so many great books. Mine is by no means the best book, but one, you know, the most recent one today to talk about the extent of systemic racism, you know, but I have a feeling that this brother is not, you know, unable to get to a bookstore. So I would say, particularly for someone you have that close of a relationship with, you've really got to get to the heart of why it's important to him to believe that. And what I found in my travels is that one of the core sources of resistance is this fear of a zero sum, this fear that if I say that there is systemic racism, that it means that I am going to have to give up something. And I do think that you're, you know, in a truly equal world, yes, some of the little privileges that are unfair are going to have to be surrendered, but we're going to gain so much more, because the privileges that matter most to white people, the privilege to not be scared of the police, the privilege to have you know, greater access to healthcare and have better funded schools, those are not privileges that racial justice advocates want to take away from white people. They're ones that we truly believe should be the rights and the basic dignities afforded to all human beings. So maybe that's really underneath it. Like, why is it important to him to ignore the science, ignore the data, ignore the facts? You might have to get to that sort of underlying motivation in order to really convince him to open his heart and his mind and sort of let go of that resistance.
Thank you, appreciate that. Here's a question from Marcus Robinson. He says, has anyone done the research, in parentheses math, on wealth suppression of racism? For example, what if the relevant workforce statistic and wealth statistics of working class Blacks and people of color was at parity with the white counterparts? Is there data out there on this kind of thing?
There sure is. There sure is. I reference a bunch of it in the book, but here's just a quick sort of marquee number from the summer from Citigroup, from a think tank within Citigroup, which calculated that if the United States had adopted policies to close the racial economic divides between Blacks and whites, over the last 20 years, our economy would have been $16 trillion more productive, would have been $16 trillion bigger in terms of US GDP. And there have been a lot of studies like this. There was one recently, just in the past 2 weeks, from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, that showed that just in 2019 alone, the economic divide between white men and everybody else cost the economy $2.6 trillion. So it's real money, and it's also logical, right? I mean, if you have so many of the players on your team on the sidelines because they don't have the opportunity or they're too saddled with debt to play, right? Of course, you're going to score fewer points. I mean, this is just a very simple economic idea. And this is why, for me, as someone who worked in economic policy, it felt so frustrating that we would give reams of data about the benefits of these kinds of public interest policies, and yet they fell on deaf ears because there was a whole other framework and conversation happening that in the United States, particularly when we're talking about ideas about status and belonging, ideas about who deserves and who merits, so often so racialized.
Another question that is kind of also one of those emblematic questions that come up in from various people along these lines of, Daniel says, I am part of a small community group. We have just gotten started. We are in a mostly white suburban town. We have anti-racism as our founding principle and will work on changing our local landscape to educate ourselves. What would be your suggestion for the first one or two things we should work on? We are now looking at equity in our local school system and also creating a police force which can be integrated and held to high community standards.
Great, great. I mean, first of all, I just have to say, you know, people do ask me, so what should we do? There's some recommendations in the book for sure, but just that, what was that person's name?
Daniel.
Daniel, for you to do that is so powerful. So much of our discourse about racism and anti-racism can end up making you feel very individualistic, right? Like I just need to read, I need to change my own thinking. It's a very sort of, you know, kind of American me thing. I think the best things that we can do, the most powerful and impactful things we can do are those things that we do together in collective action. It just obviously multiplies the force and the impact of our efforts. And so you joining a group, creating a group is just a hugely important step. So thank you for doing it. I do think that this book will have some things for you, some areas that maybe if you read it in a book club with your group, you can decide, you know, the thing that's most exciting to us is to look at you know, potentially the map of environmental racism in our community, or, you know, obviously schools and police are two huge issues. One place that has had a lot of grassroots activism is the idea of, you know, of place, right? Of school funding tied to property taxes, of local zoning. I talk about, there's a chapter on segregation and housing, and I talk about the racist underpinnings of the zoning laws that drape the map of 75% of many of our largest, you know, metropolitan areas that require, you know, single family housing, which is itself an early kind of innovation around anti-discrimination laws, and is something that is now costing so many people who are seeking affordable housing and are unable to get it because we have these restrictions on building apartments and duplexes and multifamily dwellings. So there's so many areas. What you've got to find is something that you're passionate about, and something that gives you a little bit of joy. I'm a huge believer that this work, anti-racism work, social justice work, social change work, has to feed you. You can't just do it because you're angry all the time. You know, I mean, Elizabeth Warren says fight like every other sentence, but you can tell when you're talking to her, like you're just energized, and you've got to be able to have something that, you know, lights you up like that.
Okay, a question that I think is certainly in a lot of people's minds right now from Jeff. He says, how do you feel the recent anti-Asian violence while the nation is still fighting injustice of Black Americans?
Yeah. Listen, once you create a hierarchy of human value and a scaffolding of deservingness and humanity in a society, as our society did from its founding, you are going to have levels of dehumanization and violence. It is not surprising to me at all. It is tragic. It is particularly tragic that it has not gotten the attention that it deserves. It's definitely something that I've been, you know, really committed to speaking out about. It's not a zero sum, not only between white people and people of color, it's not a zero sum between different groups of people of color. This kind of core dehumanization and permission to violence that is enabled by racist rhetoric from the very top, which is, you know, what happens when you have this hate for profit machine, this hate for profiting in terms of political power and economic power. It costs lives. We have got to speak up against the demonization of our Asian and Asian American brothers and sisters around the coronavirus pandemic. Anybody who says the kind of rhetoric that enables this, like calling it the China virus and all of that, we have to obviously, speak up in our communities, and we have to raise the level of attention and bring people to justice to make sure that everybody's life is valued.
And let's see, we're at 7:57. We probably have time for at least two more questions. So here's one from Levis. He says, how do we as a country move away from a version of capitalism that benefits the rich disproportionately to one that offers every American a truly fair opportunity to earn a living wage?
Yeah, I mean, that really is the question. So I think we actually had hit on the formula in the United States, and it was when our country and our wage growth and our sort of small business starts were growing among the fastest in our history. It was when we had a minimum wage that, adjusted for inflation, was nearly double what it is today. It's when we had, levels of unionization and collective bargaining that was 6 times what it is today. It was when we had real strong monopoly and antitrust laws so that big businesses weren't choking off competition and enterprise, and so many other sort of elements of a kind of capitalism that nonetheless created, had limits, and had a sense of commitment to a higher standard of living. And as I said, it had an asterisk, and it was the removing of that asterisk that created a newfound ambivalence among the majority of white people to that model, if it meant that they would have to share the benefits of that model with people that they'd been taught to distrust and to disdain. And so I think our challenge is to create a new version of an economic model that puts people and planet first. It's totally within our power. The policy ideas are there. It's just that the public will, and I will be specific here, the public will of the majority of white voters is not aligned. We still had the majority of white voters vote for Donald Trump's version of America in 2020 and so we can't get there without more of our white brothers and sisters coming along with the vision of a solidarity dividend.
Oh. Heather, it's been such a night of learning for so many people. I've been, my desk keeps vibrating because people keep texting me like, oh my gosh, such a great, and I'm not looking at any of those texts. So if you're texting me, I'm not looking at my text. It's just such a great night and so much learning. The book is so brilliant and so beautiful. As I was telling you in the green room, it's just deep. I mean, you just lay it right out there. I think the phrase I use is that it is so modern, and now you're a shooting star, man. And it's just a pleasure and an honor to host you. So for those of you, I know there were some folks had a little bit of a snafu when you first joined the Zoom. We got that sorted out really quickly. So sorry if you had any difficulty initially, but thank you all for coming, and we really appreciate it. And thanks to Senator Warren again in her absence. What a great way to have a launch party, Heather. You're a lucky person.
Yes, absolutely, I am. Thank you, Lonnie, for being in my corner, and thank you all 1.1 thousand of you who've been part of this conversation. Pick up the Sum of Us, read it with someone else. Let's do this together.
Absolutely. It's great for book club. Great book club pick. I'll put that as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night.